Cinnamon, where you gonna run to? Cinnamon, where you gonna run to? Where you gonna run to? All on that day.
Hello and welcome to The Breakdown, brought to you by The Nation magazine and TheNation.com. I'm Chris Hayes, Washington editor of The Nation. Each week here on The Breakdown, we take your questions via Twitter at Chris L. Hayes or via email at thebreakdown@thenation.com. The way it works is this. You send us questions about what's perplexing you this week in Washington, and we try to break it down.
Will I run to the rock? Please hide me, I run to the rock. Please hide me, I run to the rock. Please hide me, Lord.
Hello, welcome back to The Breakdown, Week 45, Episode 45 in a Collector's Series. This week, we have a question that comes from David Swanson. That Twitter handle is David C. Swanson, and he's an activist and writer you've probably seen around, and he wants to know, how much could the U.S. cut Pentagon spending and still maintain the most expensive military on the planet? Got another question from someone else who followed up and said, how much Pentagon spending could be cut such that we still outspent all the other countries combined? And to answer the question of just how much we can cut and still maintain American exceptionalism in the realm of the military, I have Dr. Miriam Pemberton. She's a research fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. She writes and speaks on demilitarization issues as part of the Foreign Policy in Focus project, and she leads a group that produces the annual Unified Security Budget for the United States. It's a really great document that lays out in brass tacks terms how we can reduce military spending and still be a secure country. Miriam, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Okay, so maybe let's start out with just a few. I don't want to get super number heavy since this is an audio podcast and sometimes numbers start to swim around in one's head when spoken. But let's give a few baselines here. How much do we spend every year on defense, and what percentage of the discretional budget is that, and how much has that gone up over the last 10 years? Let's start with there. Like, how much are we spending and what's the trend line?
There ought to be a simple answer. It sort of depends what you count. There's what we call the base budget, which is what we spend whether we're going to war or not. And then, as your listenership probably knows, we add on top what we actually spend to go to war. So the base budget this year, so the budget's coming out on Monday, Valentine's Day, and what I hear is that the base budget is going to be about $553 billion, but that doesn't include the $140 billion that we're going to spend on the war. And it also doesn't include what we spend on the nuclear weapons complex. And then you can add in, various things that you may or may not want to count, like Veterans Affairs and the interest that we pay on the debt to sustain this military spending. But if you want to call just the base budget the military budget, then that's going to be about $553 billion. If you put the war in, which obviously you should,
I think we should put let's say base. Let's say as a reasonable estimate here, the base budget plus the war, which brings us to what, around
$700 billion. That's a nice round figure.
That's great. That's a nice round figure. You may recall a similar figure from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, which is better known as the stimulus. That came in at around $770 billion, so 10% more, but of course was split over 2 years. That was the big government footprint, the thing that was going to bankrupt us and put all this debt to our grandkids. That's one half of what is just the routine expenses of the current war and the DOD budget, and doesn't count a whole bunch of other stuff. Is that sort of where things are?
That is absolutely right.
So when we're talking about $700 billion, what percentage of the overall discretionary budget is that? That sounds like a lot of it.
About half, yeah.
It's about half.
It's more than half. More than half.
When you don't look at Social Security, Medicare, other things that are part of the non-discretionary budget, but just what we sort of appropriate every year affirmatively, more than half of what we appropriate is going to be for defense. Now, this is like an old lefty trope, right? We've all seen the bumper sticker of like, it'll be a great day when the Air Force has to hold a bake sale and schools have all the money they want, et cetera. And you've been working on this issue for a while. And has it gotten better or worse, say, over the last 10 years? Because it's obviously we spend a lot of defense. We spend a lot on defense going back a long time, probably since World War II at least. But within the category of spending a lot in defense, there's differences in trends. What has the trend been over, say, the last 10 years?
Trend is expanded by 67% since 2001.
67%.
And it's now higher than at any time since
higher in inflation-adjusted dollars?
In inflation-adjusted terms, yes.
Okay. So that's pretty high.
It is.
And I guess one thing maybe to clarify is that that is not because, I mean, the obvious thing you would say is, well, we had 9/11 and whether you supported or opposed the war in Afghanistan and then subsequently Iraq, those were expensive. So, yeah, if we're fighting two wars, no wonder we're spending more money. Is it just the wars that account for that expansion of that massive 67% expansion over a decade?
No, the base budget has gone up a pace right along with the war spending budget. So that Congress basically after 9/11 just decided that there would be no holds barred. There would be no limits to what we would spend on our security, and so that's what we've got now. And so there was no limit on the base budget, and there was no limit on the war spending budget, and it couldn't be challenged. And now there are some challenges focused on our debt problem.
Right. That seems like that's the big kind of perfect storm that's emerging here, which is that there's a certain rhetoric which is mostly emanating from the political right about anxiety over the size of the American annual deficit, which is a flow, and the debt, which is a stock, it's a number that we add to, and the effect that's going to have on interest rates and our grandchildren, blah, blah, blah. You've heard it all before. And so we have to cut the budget, and if you're going to cut the budget, as we've just said, over 50% of the discretionary budget is the military. Maybe you should start looking at that. What indications are we seeing that that is something that might be on the table both from the White House and Congress?
Yeah, I mean, it's completely split the Republican Party, which is really interesting. A lot of the Tea Partiers really, almost everyone says, well, everything should be on the table, including Pentagon spending. And that includes, the House Majority Leader, Eric Cantor, has said exactly that. And the president says it. But it's important to know that the president is going to put forward a budget which the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, keeps calling cuts. And most of the media talks about Gates's budget cuts. It's important to know that in real terms, what he's really talking about is they plan ahead and they're planning for increases. And then when they say, well, we're going to slow that rate of increase, we're going to define that as a cut. Now, in my mind, that is not a cut. So it's important to know that.
Right. So we're not even, say freezing at a certain level, which I think would count as a cut, right? If you say, we're going to freeze it at 2010 levels because there's inflation. And we're talking about increases actually over and above the rate of inflation.
Right. The president talks about everything on the table, but then he exempts the defense budget from this 5-year freeze that he's going to be proposing on Monday. The head of the budget committee who's proposing this $100 billion of cuts likewise exempts the defense budget. And yet, we've seen all this disarray in the Republican Congress, and it's not at all clear that the Tea Partiers are going to go along with exempting the defense budget because a lot of them have talked about cutting it. So it's going to be a very interesting time.
So let's circle back then and try to answer the question. So, let's say we're spending $700 billion this year. How much can we take out of that and still have the most expensive military on the planet?
Well, I sort of figured this out, and the answer is we could cut it. We could cut it by 87% and still spend more than the next country, which is China. They claim to spend about $70 billion. Independent sources jack it up a little higher, but even if you go a little higher, you're not going to get much above 90 or 100. So we can cut most of our budget and still be the most expensive military on the planet.
What if that's not good enough? What if, from the perspective as the world's lone superpower, we want to make sure that not only are we the most expensive military, but we actually outspend all the other countries combined? What's that look like?
Well, we don't actually, at the moment, spend more than all the other countries.
Oh, that's
combined.
good to know. I feel like that.
However,
yeah.
However, if you want to acknowledge that we do have some allies, and our main recognized alliance is the NATO alliance. So if you put what NATO spends with what the U.S. spends, then we do spend those two together. And since we're not likely to be going to war anytime soon against Britain or France, we are spending more than the rest of the world put together.
So the U.S. plus NATO is more than the rest of the world put together.
Correct. Right.
Well, so it seems like there's a fair amount of give there. I mean, the big question always is the entrenched interests, both defense contractors and congressional representatives who have either bases or contractors in their district, and also the kind of rhetoric of a strong military. I mean, are those the big obstacles to cuts?
Yep, that about says it. Those are the ones, yeah.
So we will watch this story carefully. Maybe we'll have you back on as the budget proceeds. Miriam Pemberton is a research fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, and she helps put together the unified security budget for the United States every year, and she's my sort of go-to source for military spending issues. Miriam, thanks so much for joining us on The Breakdown.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Breakdown is a weekly production of The Nation magazine and TheNation.com. New audiocasts are posted each Friday at TheNation.com and available on iTunes. The Breakdown was produced by Ryan Rafferty and yours truly. Senior producer at The Nation is Emily Douglas. Comments and feedback should be sent to The Breakdown at TheNation.com.
Oh, Cinnamon, where you gonna run to? Cinnamon, where you gonna run to? Where you gonna run to all on that day?